Hi there, I'm recording this for anyone who missed today's Zoom. My computer is very slow lately, so bear with me. So if you weren't here on November, and by here I mean in the Zoom on November 9th or 10th, you need to do the reading questions for chapter 10 and 11. I picked out some specific passages for you to go back and read and do some digging. And then we just recapped chapter 12 and talked about it. It's a pretty important chapter. And then your work for the afternoon is to read chapters 13 to 15 and take the reading quiz. I did warn everyone in the Zoom today that this week is really heavy on reading so that we can finish the novel next week and have plenty of time to wrap up the trimester. So we have a lot of chapters to read in the next few days, but I have faith in you guys. You can do it. And the sooner we finish, then the sooner we can the more time we can spend with the discussion analysis part of it. Okay, so chapter 10, you guys have some questions to answer, but I just noticed as I was rereading it that the narrator says Chillingworth is probing into the minister's deepest thoughts and memories, etc. And it says, then after a long search into the minister's dim interior, and this was definitely deliberate on Hawthorne's part, I think. Dimmesdale, get it? So Dimmesdale is called Dimmesdale for a reason, and Chillingworth, as you can imagine, also has that name for a reason. Everything is symbolic in this novel, if you haven't already noticed. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 12. Chapter 11 is all about the minister and how he's just physically ill with the guilt of his sin, and he struggles with the idea of confessing it. He even tries to tell his congregation that he's a sinner, and that just makes him more holy seeming in their eyes. So he has this like inner conflict of wanting to confess, but he doesn't have the courage to do it. So after, whipping himself with a scourge in the end of chapter 11 and not feeling any relief, it says, a new thought had struck him. There might be a moment's peace in it. So he gets up, gets dressed, goes to the scaffold in the middle of the night where Hester Prynne had lived through her first hours of public ignominy. Ignominy, I think I'm saying that word right. Anyway, the scaffold is that raised wooden platform where Hester had to stand for several hours in the first chapters while everyone stared at her and judged her, and it was awful. But in Hester's case, at least her sin is out there in the open, in public, and it's kind of ruined her life, but at the same time, she's not being eaten away with guilt like Dimmesdale is. So Dimmesdale thinks, maybe if I go and stand on the scaffold, it'll help relieve some of this guilt I'm feeling. But unfortunately, it's the middle of the night, and it's an especially dark night, and nobody sees him. So it's not going to help him. He at some point lets out this kind of little mad shriek, and then he gets scared because he thinks people are going to wake up and see him on the scaffold, and what will they think with their minister on the scaffold, and they'll discover he's a sinner. But alas, no one's around except for, they think maybe Governor Bellingham and his sister, who perhaps heard the little shriek because Governor Bellingham's sister, Mistress Hibbins, is apparently a witch. He does at some point see Reverend Wilson, who is a friend of his, but Reverend Wilson doesn't notice him either. So then Dimmesdale imagines what would happen if he were to stay there until the morning and the townspeople woke up and discovered that their minister is a sinner. And then it says, carried away by the grotesque horror of this picture, the minister burst into a great peal of laughter. Again, this guilt, this inner turmoil that he's experienced is making him a little bit insane, actually. And then, surprise, Pearl laughs back at him. So Pearl and her mother are out in the middle of the night. He calls out to Pearl. She responds. Turns out that Hester was at Governor Winthrop's, who has just died, to take his measurements in order to make him burial garments. So that's why they're out in the middle of the night. Dimmesdale wants Pearl and Hester to join him on the scaffold, and they do so. And when they do, it says, the minister felt for the child's hand and took it. The moment that he did so, there came what seemed a tumultuous rush of new life. other life than his own, pouring like a torrent into his heart and hurrying through all his veins, as if the mother and the child were communicating their vital warmth to his half-torpid system. The three formed an electric chain. I read this again, and this struck me as an important quote, but I'm not 100% sure what Hawthorne means by it. Here's my two interpretations that I think. For one, Dimmesdale's becoming very weak, physically ill because of the guilt he's experiencing and the fact that he hasn't been able to publicly confess the sin and feel any relief. And so one interpretation I have is that maybe like Hester and Pearl are much stronger characters. They have to live day to day with this mistake that Hester made, and they seem to be stronger for it. And so maybe like their presence, holding hands with them, has given him like a moment, like momentarily energized. But another interpretation that I have of it is one of the things that's going on in this novel is what the Puritan community, the Puritan society thinks about rules and behavior and how you're supposed to act. And then on the other hand, there's nature. And we've seen this pop up a few times in the novel. And the Puritans are very judgmental of Hester's sin. It was wrong. It was terrible. They worry about Pearl and how, because she was a product of sin. But nature seems to have a different opinion of Hester, Dimmesdale, and Pearl, and a more favorable opinion. So when I read this quote, it almost makes me think like, yes, in the Puritan society, this is an illegitimate family. But in nature, if you take society and religion out of it, they could be like a normal family, the three of them. So this makes me think like in some other realm, the three of them are like destined to be together. So that's my interpretation. You can make of it what you will, but it struck me as really important. Okay, so then Pearl, after that, says, will you stand with us and my mother tomorrow at noon, like on the scaffold again, but during the day when everyone can see? And Dimmesdale says, no, that'll never happen, but I will stand with the two of you on Judgment Day. So when they all die and they're at the pearly gates of heaven and are being judged, then he'll stand with them. And Pearl isn't very satisfied by that answer. And just then there's a bright light on the horizon, which is either a meteor or a big fat symbol. So there's, okay. Also looking very symbolic right now is the minister with his hand over his heart, Hester Prynne with the scarlet letter on her heart, and Pearl, who, as I've mentioned before, is a symbol and a character. Pearl grins a little and points. Dimmesdale sees what looks like an immense letter A marked out in red light. So there's a meteor going across the sky, and it looks like a giant letter A. And we'll talk about what this could potentially mean in a moment. It says, then Pearl points out Roger Chillingworth, who Dimmesdale finally notices is looking kind of evil. So Dimmesdale asks Hester, like, who is this man? He freaks me out. And Hester knows, obviously, but doesn't say anything because she made this promise to Chillingworth. Chillingworth steps forward and gets Dimmesdale to come home with him. Doesn't really say anything about how weird it is that the three of them are out in the middle of the night, but he takes them home, or takes Dimmesdale home, excuse me. The next day, Dimmesdale gives an A+ sermon. So in chapter 11, it mentions this about how the fact that he is a sinner makes him a much more, he's able to empathize with his congregation better, and that makes him a better preacher. And so after this particular experience, it says that he gives his richest, most powerful, most replete with heavenly influences sermon, and that more souls than one were brought to the truth by the efficacy of that sermon. So this sermon was very powerful, brought people to God, etc. And then it says, as he comes down the pulpit steps, the sexton, who is a church employee, hands him a glove, his glove, which the sexton had found on the scaffolding. The sexton's theory, Satan must have dropped it there, of course. By the way, the sexton says, but he doesn't think anything of it. By the way, the sexton says, did Dimmesdale see the letter A in the sky last night? It was a portent of the death of Governor Winthrop, surely now an angel. So the townspeople interpret that A in the sky as angel for the governor who has passed away. But Hawthorne notes that this symbol is interpreted differently depending on who's looking at it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So symbols in this chapter. The scaffold is an important symbol. And in this scene, it highlights the difference between Hester and Dimmesdale's situation. So Hester has been suffering in this novel, but her sin is out there in the open, whereas Dimmesdale has this internal suffering because of his guilt and sin, and it's kind of eating him away on the inside. Whereas Hester has a miserable life, but she's, like, guilt-wise, she's okay. And so it helps establish an ironic contrast between her public torments and his inner anguish. And then the meteor. So to Dimmesdale, the meteor implies that he should be wearing a mark of shame just as Hester does. Again, it's indicating to him that he should be confessing his sin publicly. The rest of the community thinks it stands for angel, but angel is an awkward or simplistic reading of this symbol. And the Puritans commonly looked to symbols to confirm divine sentiments. In this narrative, however, symbols are taken to mean what the beholder wants them to mean. So Hawthorne basically says whoever's looking at this A in the sky, they're going to put their own interpretation on it. Interesting. Okay, so if you're wondering where I got the information, I do check SparkNotes and Schmoop sometimes for a little cheat sheet. Even English teachers do that. And, you know, my own brain. So that's chapter 12. Oh my gosh, that was a long video.